In the year 376, reports reached the officers of garrisons along the Danube River that a new and unusually large movement had begun among the northern barbarians. It was said that all the people between the Theiss River and the Black Sea were in disarray. A savage people of great ferocity had struck the nation with terror and sent them fleeing from their homes. The officers of the garrisons didn't take this news seriously, because they rarely ever heard of any barbarian wars beyond the Danube, until the fight had either completely died off, or had at least come to a temporary close. Their experience told them that no exceptional events could be expected. But this time it was different. The rumors persisted, and then the first refugees appeared on the northern bank of the river. The first fugitives were joined by others, and yet others, until an immense multitude of people crowded on the bank of the river, begging to be taken into the safety of the empire. The kingdom of Gothic King Ermanaric had fallen, and most of the Thervingi Goths have fled from their country to seek the safety inside the Roman Empire. The savage and ferocious people that they were running from were none other than the Huns. And this is how the Huns were introduced to the Romans for the very first time. And since then, the Romans have written extensively about the Huns, and then went on to become one of the most important sources of our knowledge about the Huns. And so you might be surprised that much of the history of the Huns is either interwoven with that of Romans, or is written in the context of Roman history. Because without the anchorage of the Romans' history, the history of the Huns would just be pieces of events, with no real context to it. But the story of the Huns in the Romans' books doesn't start here. It goes back a few years back, and a few hundred miles northeast of this region. The Alans had been the first people who had been reduced to subjection by the Huns. Before the Huns' attack, they had occupied a territory between the River Don and the Caspian Sea. They had often attacked the Bosphorus in Crimea, and even Armenia and Media, so that the Romans knew of them that, like the other nomads, they were unconquerable warriors. But they had been conquered now. At what date and in circumstances we do not know. We only know that a vast number of them were slaughtered before the nation submitted. It seems to have been soon after the year 370 that the Huns, joined by their Alanic subjects, began their assault on the rich villages of the great Ostrogothic kingdom. This newly built empire stretched from the Don to the Dniester, and from the Black Sea to the Pripyat marshes, and their influence reached as far as Esti on the Baltic coast. However, the boundaries of the Ostrogothic Empire cannot be defined, simply because it had none. It was attacked first by small parties of the Huns, but soon had to bear their full assault. While the bulk of the Huns' forces drove straight across the steppes along the north coast of the Black Sea, a smaller party entered the Crimea from the east, and drove the Gothic inhabitants into the mountains, and then passing through Isthmus they joined the mass of their companions, probably leaving only a small group of Huns to exploit the peninsula. The old Gothic king Ermanaric of the Ostrogothic kingdom, although unnerved by the rumors of the Huns' savagery, he was able to hold them off for a considerable amount of time. And then in despair, he committed suicide and was succeeded by his great-nephew Vithemiris. Vithemiris with some Huns mercenaries, whom he had bought them to his side, fought off the Alans invaders who were being made to fight by the Huns. With these mercenaries and his own followers, Vithemiris went into battle with the Huns again and again, but each time he met with a severe and bloody defeat. Finally, in a battle said to have been fought on a certain river Iraq, somewhere between the Dnieper and the Dniester River, after only about 1 year of reign, he was killed. Most of the Ostrogothic nation now submitted to the Huns, but the story that was told afterward, that they voluntarily abandoned the struggle, is only a Gothic fable, designed to explain away their crushing defeat. The remainders were now ruled by Vithemiris' son Videricus, but as he was still a child, the command of the army was entrusted to Elatheus and Saphrax. Now the name Saphrax is said not to be Germanic and may be Hunnic. If the Saphrax was a Hun, it would seem that once mercenaries hired by Vithemiris had now won so much authority that their leader had actually obtained a share in the Gothic high command. Now, despite the skill and courage of Elatheus and Saphrax, the Goths were gradually forced back behind the river Dniester. This brought the Huns to the frontiers of Athanaric, the chief of the Visigoths, whose country had been devastated by Emperor Valens in 3 successive campaigns a few years back. Athanaric decided to resist the new invaders if he was to be attacked, and so he established himself on the bank of the Dniester, not far from Elatheus and Saphrax. His first move was to send some of his chief men led by Munderic, about 20 miles beyond the river, with instructions to report on the movement of the enemy, and to screen the main body as he prepared his defenses. Huns soon realized that Munderic's force was just a fraction of the Gothic army, and decided to ignore it. Then, riding hard through a moonlit night, they completely outmaneuvered and eluded Munderic, and before he could even discover their whereabouts, they had forded the Dniester River 20 miles in his rear. Athanaric had no suspicion of his danger. He and his army were stunned by the surprise of the Huns' attack. There was no resistance. The Goths scattered to the Carpathian foothills behind them with slight losses. Elatheus and Saphrax appear to have been crushed simultaneously. The Huns swept onward, as one Roman historian writes, like an avalanche, from the mountaintops, carrying away, or destroying everything, in their path. Athanaric next decided to build and defend a wall between the Pruth and the Danube River. The work was hurried on with skill and vigor, but again the troops were surprised. They would have been massacred if the Huns didn't have the weight of the booty, which prevented them from carrying out their usual swift maneuvers. The Thervingian Goths were panic-stricken. They could not resist any longer. His rival leader Fritigern, and his ally Elavius, had no intention of joining Athanaric and continuing the fight, and they preferred to retreat rather than face the Huns. In the spring of 376, Fritigern and his ally Elavius ordered their followers to head straight for the Danube. And so they melted away from Athanaric, and with their families and their goods began to stream towards the Danube. As more and more of them reached the Danube, the Roman officers on its southern bank began to realize that the reports which they had heard with contempt were nothing more than the truth. In the autumn of 376, the Goths, said by contemporaries to number 200,000, were permitted to cross the Danube. However, the mistreatment of these Goths by the Roman officer after their crossing caused an uprising among the Thervingian Goths. They defeated the garrison troops and began to loot and plunder all the villages and unfortified cities. After the Battle of Ad Salisas, in the autumn of 377, the Goths were penned in among the defile of Mount Haemus in Thrace by a Roman army. The Romans had hastily fortified the mountain passes. The Goths soon found themselves stuck between the sea to their left, the mountain to their right and front, and the Danube River to their back. Everything that could serve as food throughout the lands of Scythia and Moesia had been used up, and all their efforts to break through the ring formed by the Romans had been beaten back. So the situation was rapidly getting desperate. And it was in this situation that they had to call the Huns for their help. The people that they were running from now became the last resort to their survival. Some of their numbers somehow managed to slip through the enemy lines and arrange an alliance with a body of Huns and Alans, who were roaming in the land north of the Danube. The Gothic emissaries held out hopes of immense booty if the nomads would rescue them from their critical position. The effect of this alliance was striking. As soon as the Roman commanders heard of it, they at once began to withdraw their men cautiously. The Goths escaped from the trap in which they had been caught, and began once again to devastate the unlucky countryside of Thrace. The final showdown of this uprising took place in the Battle of Adrianople, in which the Romans were badly defeated, and almost 2/3 of their troops were slaughtered, including Emperor Valens. But the Huns stayed away from this fight. They waited to see who would be the winner. The Huns were out here only for looting, and had no desire to spill their blood for the Goths. In the next 2 years, our sources repeatedly named the Huns, Goths, and the Alans together, but whether the Huns looted and burned down the villages of Thrace, all by themselves or as the allies of the Goths, is not known. We hear a little of the Huns in the years that immediately followed. We are assured explicitly, however, that they took their full share in the plundering and devastation of the North Balkan provinces, in the period after the Battle of Adrianople. In the year 384, the Juthungi, a Germanic people in the region north of the Danube River, were preparing an attack in Rhaetia. Juthungi had attacked Rhaetia the previous year, as well as several years earlier. Now Botto was a Romanized Frank, who served as a magister militum of the Roman Empire under Valentinian II at this point. He was an experienced and resourceful soldier, but his troops were few except for the Gothic mercenaries, who were not so reliable. These Githungi were instigated to raid Rhaetia by Maximus, a usurper who had made himself the undisputed master of Gaul after the death of Gratian. Botto knew that if they pressed the attack, and somehow they crossed the Alpine passes, Botto would lose. Maximus could then just walk into Italy, not as an aggressor, but as the savior of the Roman world from the barbarians. It was then that Botto turned to the Huns and Alans. The only source, which is a short passage in a letter of Bishop Ambrose to Valentinian II, does not give us any other details, such as the strength of the Hunnic and Alan cavalry, the men who led them, or the battle they fought. But it seems that they crushed the Githungi in one great sweep. Their task was fulfilled. The Githungian danger was removed. The Huns could now return to their country. But they did not. They kept riding west, approaching Gaul. When the news reached Milan, Botto must have been horrified. Although Theodosius, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, had decided to defend Italy, he was not willing to assist Botto in an open attack on Maximus. If the Huns, Botto's allies, broke into Gaul, Maximus must take this as an open declaration of war. So they had to be stopped. And so they were. Botto purchased their retreat with gold. We have no idea how much he paid them, but it may be assumed that they were richly compensated for the loss of booty they could have expected to make in Gaul. The Huns to whom Botto turned for help cannot have lived deep in the Barbaricum far to the east. If their sites were not already west of the Danube, then they must have lived along the river Danube, or very close to its left bank. As early as 384, large tracts of the Hungarian plain were held by the Huns and their Alanic allies. This was an impressive achievement by any standards. It had taken the Huns just over 10 years to conquer the immense region stretching from western Hungary in the west to the Volga River in the east, and also to largely secure this turbulent region. Our information about the Huns after 386 gets scantier. All that we have are brief allusions in poetical works. But we can draw from it the conclusion that in the 390s, there evidently was no Hun ruler strong enough to enforce his will on all tribes. The Hun groups at this point were waging their own wars and making their own peace. Those in Hungarian plain pillaged Pannonia, and those in Romania the Thrace. They concluded alliances and broke them at their own will, and not at king's pleasure. Overall, there were no big events that the Huns undertook until it was 395. By 395 AD, the Huns were ready to expand again, and the campaign that they conceived was a gigantic undertaking, and on a bigger scale than any other until the days of Attila. The main eastern wing of the Huns launched a major offensive through the Caucasus, against both the Sasanian Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. The western wing of the Huns at the same time launched a simultaneous incursion into the Balkans from the west. Passing through Caucasus, their bands overran Armenia. One group crossed the Euphrates and was defeated by a Roman army, while two armies recorded in later sources as under the leadership of Basich and Kursich rode down the Euphrates and threatened the Persian capital Ctesiphon. One of these armies was defeated by the Persians, while the other successfully retreated. A final group of Huns ravaged Asia Minor. The Huns devastated parts of Syria and Cappadocia, and threatened Antioch. Jerome, a Catholic priest, writes vividly of this raid. "Behold, the wolves, not of Arabia, but of the north, were let loose upon us last year, from the far-off rocks of Caucasus, and in a little while, overran great provinces. How many monasteries were captured? How many streams were reddened with human blood? Antioch was besieged, and the other cities washed by the Halys, Cydnus, Orontes, and Euphrates. Flocks of captives were dragged away. Arabia, Phoenicia, Palestine, and Egypt were taken captive by their terror. There was no regular army to meet them. Theodosius at his death had left the armies of the empire in the west. The invasion was therefore unopposed, until Eutropius, quickly coming to terms with the Goths, reinforced his troops with the Goths' men and moved east, and finally succeeded in taking the field against them. However, he failed to recover the booty they had taken. But peace was restored to the east at the end of 398, and he was made consul in 399. The cause of the invasion in 395 is said to have been a famine in the country of the Huns. Indeed, they drove away as many herds of cattle as they could. But first of all, they made thousands of prisoners. The raid became a gigantic slave hunt. After Balamber, whose historicity has been refuted, Uldan is the first Hun leader in Europe mentioned by name. He controlled a territory close to the Danube. After the war in the early 5th century, Arcadius, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, had made ties with Uldan. When Gainas, a Gothic leader who served the Eastern Roman Empire as Magister Militum, fled across the borders with his Gothic followers, Uldan did not think it safe to allow a barbarian with an army of his own to take up dwellings across the Danube. He therefore collected his forces and attacked the Goths. The campaign ended with his victory and Gainas was killed. 11 days later, Gainas's head was put on display in Constantinople. An alliance with Uldan might have been planned by Arcadius, to use Uldan's Huns against the Goths, with whom they had negotiated peace in 397. Because it was clear that the government in Constantinople was no longer prepared to negotiate with the Goths. If this was the case, then the tactics worked. By the end of the year, Alaric, the leader of the Goths, had left the Eastern Empire and moved west. Now there were these other Goths who had remained north of the Rhine-Danube frontier since the Hun invasion in the 370s, but now they had migrated deep inside the empire, seeking safety from the disruption caused by the Huns' presence west of the Black Sea. After Alaric's Goths had moved west, Uldan offered his services to Stilicho, a military commander of the Western Roman Empire. This new combination of Romans and the Huns under Uldan proved effective. In late 406, these new Goths under the leadership of Radagaisus, who were entering into the empire, were wiped out by the combined army. A huge number of his followers were taken prisoners and sold into slavery, that the Italian market was flooded and the prices of slaves dropped quickly. The revenue raised helped in paying the Uldan's Huns. This instability along the Rhine-Danube frontier was a direct result of the westward push of the Huns. A gradual process, the overall pattern of which is clear. Across 40 years from 370 to 410, the focus of Huns' activities slowly moved 700 miles, from the Don to the Dniester, and then to the Middle Danube, and finally westward to Hungary. By the beginning of the 5th century, the Huns were firmly established on the Great Hungarian Plain in the heart of Europe. It is a landscape of wide horizons and endless flat fields, a treeless grassy expanse, broken only by swamps and lakes full of green algae. This open plain was a sharp contrast to the terrain south of the Danube with its narrow valleys and heavily forested mountain slopes. As a home for the Huns, the Great Hungarian Plain was self-selecting. West of the Black Sea, it was the only area of grassland large enough to support horses on any scale. Located in the middle of Europe, it was an ideal base, from which to launch attacks both north and south of the Danube. Yet compared with the vast wildernesses of Central Asia, the Hungarian plain was not even a quarter of its size. Survival in this more constrained European environment forced a social and political revolution among the Huns. Failure to adapt to this environment would be a defeat, and would require retreat back to the steppes. In their initial westward push, the Huns relied on their superior fighting skills and rapid mobility to raid local villages and unfortified cities. The Great Hungarian Plain, although offered grazing for their horses, it simply was not large enough to sustain the traditional nomadic life of the Huns that they had followed in the steppes. Rather, the Great Hungarian Plain offered the Huns a different set of possibilities. In this richer, more densely populated, and more productive land, they were able to use their military advantage to establish themselves as an effective force over other local people. A crucial change in the Hun tactics came at the beginning of the 5th century. Instead of leaving shattered villages, slaughtered farmers, and burn up buildings behind them, it was more profitable to demand regular tribute from local people. The Hun Empire, as it expanded across Europe, was successful in systematizing the extraction of wealth and manpower from conquered territory. Now back to Uldan. So in the year 401, He had dealt directly with Arcadius, whose aim was probably to use the Hun troops against the Goths in the Balkans. Then in 406, he took his followers west to serve as mercenaries in Stilicho's army, defending the empire against another group of Goths led by Radagaisus. 3 years later, Uldin and his men were back in the east, but this time as a hostile force. In the year 408, he led a Hun war band across the Danube, and captured Castra Martis, a fortress lying well back from the river in the province of Moesia. He took this place by treachery. And then he proceeded to overrun Thrace, and when the Romans tried to buy him off, he rejected their offer and demanded an impossible sum as the price of peace. His threats were expansive. He merely pointed towards the rising sun, and declared that his Hun army could conquer all the lands on which the sun shines. Confronted with such arrogance, the Roman negotiators tried a different tactics. They began discussions with Uldin's officers. According to the Christian historian Sozomen, writing 30 years later in Constantinople, Uldin's men were moved by the intervention of God to recognize the superiority of the Roman form of government, the philanthropy of the emperor, and his swiftness and generosity in rewarding the best men. And so the Roman plan worked. The Huns were bought off and the peace was concluded. Abandoned by most of his comrades, Uldin barely made it safely back across the Danube. Many of those who decided to stay with him on his desperate flight to the frontier were captured and sold into slavery. Uldin was not merely set on taking prisoners who could be sold as slaves. He didn't demand the cession of the Roman territory either. He rather demanded that the Romans pay him tribute, a fixed annual sum. But he was now defeated, and after this defeat he never showed up again. This sudden disappearance of this Hun leader right after his defeat shows how volatile the position of the leaders was in the Hunnic society. And such a volatile system was vulnerable to manipulation. Against Uldin in 408, the Romans achieved a double victory. They both purchased peace and undermined a prominent Hun. That latter tactic was repeated 4 years later, when the historian Olympiodorus was sent on an embassy to the Huns, on behalf of the East Roman court. In later 412, or early 413, Olympiodorus left the imperial capital and sailed in stormy weather. He sailed around Greece and up the Adriatic Sea, a good indication that the Huns he was to meet were located on the middle Danube. He was accompanied on the voyage by his parakeet, a bird of whom he was very proud of. They eventually reached a Hun king named Donatus, whose sphere of influence was obviously far from that of Uldin's. After exchanging oaths of friendship with Donatus, they treacherously murdered him. After his death, Charaton was chosen to succeed him. Charaton was enraged by the murder of Donatus, or simply showed a feeling of anger, to divert the suspicion of his involvement in the murder. But whether he was involved or not, we are sure that he was given a costly present in Theodosius' name to remain at peace. In early 422, Theodosius was busy fighting the Persians in the east, because of the Christian persecution in Persia. The Huns took advantage of this situation and marched south into Thrace. This incursion is recorded briefly in a 6th century chronicle as the Huns laid waste Thrace. Theodosius soon made peace with the Persians and began the movement toward Thrace. The redeployment of troops was sufficient enough to force an agreement with the Huns, who withdrew on the promise of an annual payment of 350 pounds of gold. In Constantinople, the settlements with both the Huns and the Persians were claimed as success. But in reality, it was just another failure. In 425, when the usurper John was fighting for his life against East Roman forces at Ravenna, he sent Aetius to the Huns to hire an army and bring it to Italy as quickly as possible. Now Aetius was a middle-ranking palace official and son of Gaudentius, a former governor of a province in North Africa, and then a commander of imperial troops in Gaul. In 409, while he was still a teenager, Aetius had been sent along with other aristocratic hostages, as part of Honorius' surety for 10,000 Hun mercenaries. When he returned, he was an excellent horseman and a deadly accurate bowman. And he had also formed a number of genuine friendships with Huns, whom he could both respect and trust. It was precisely this privileged relationship that John hoped to turn to his advantage. But when Aetius returned with Hun's army, he was too late. When he appeared in Italy, John had been dead for 3 days. Nevertheless, he engaged Aspar, the commander of the Eastern Roman forces, in a stubborn but apparently indecisive battle, and finally asked the Huns to leave Italy and return home. The Huns, we are told, were paid in golds, to lay aside their anger and their arms. Aetius' achievement in getting rid of them was considered to be so great that Placida and Valentinian III made peace with him, and made him the commander-in-chief of the Roman army in Gaul. It was said that the number of Huns whom he had sent home was about 60,000. In the year 432, Ruga was the king of the Huns. Ruga had other brothers named Actor, Munzuk, and Oebarcius. Munzuk was the father of Attila and Bleda, 2 future kings of the Huns. Ruga and his brother Actor had ruled the Huns together as co-rulers. But Actor died in the year 430, and since then, Ruga had been the sole ruler of the Huns. Socrates gives us the account of Actor's death in 430, which many historians have denied its historicity, but some believe that it still contains a historical kernel. Socrates writes that there was a nation of barbarians dwelling beyond the Rhine, called Burgundians. The Huns, by continuous raids and plunder, had devastated their country. Frustrated by the Huns' attack, they decided to commit themselves to the protection of some god, and having seriously considered, they chose to embrace the faith of Christ Jesus. Now that they were confident in their God, they marched against the Huns. This is how Socrates carries on in his exact words. Accordingly, becoming confident thenceforth, they marched against the tyrants, nor were they disappointed in their hope. For the king of the Huns, Aptaros by name, having burst asunder in the night from Surfeit, the Burgundians attacked that people then without a leader, and although few in numbers and their opponents many, they obtained a victory, for the Burgundians were but 3,000 men, and destroyed no less than 10,000 of the enemy. From that time on, this nation became zealously attached to the Christian religion. Now, actually, there was a diplomatic relation that had been established between the Romans and the Hun leader Rua, along with his brother Actor, who died. But in early 434, through Escalus, the Huns' ambassador at court in Constantinople, Rua declared his intention to attack a number of tribes north of the Danube. He insisted that any young men who had already fled across the frontier and joined the Roman army should be handed over without delay. While a final resolution to these demands was in progress, and the ambassadors were dispatched for a further round of talk, Romans judged that the chances of a Hun invasion were quite low. And so the troops that were sent to North Africa to fight the Vandals were not recalled. But a few months later, in the summer of 434, the Huns attacked. As the Huns devastated Thrace, moving steadily toward Constantinople, the city's terror-stricken citizens expected a long and bloody siege. Their safety would depend on the strength of the Theodosian Wall. It would be the first time that the capital's new defenses had been tested in action. But thanks to their good luck, the Huns, without any warning, began to withdraw. Their leader Rua had died suddenly, and it may be that his successors did not feel confident in establishing their authority while on a campaign. Theodosius believed that the Huns' retreat was an act of God, in direct answer to his prayers. In Constantinople, it was rumored that Rua had been struck with a lightning bolt. His followers were said to have been killed by plague and scorched by fireballs. Anyway, the imperial capital was saved, either by chance or by the well-directed intervention of the divinity. After the Huns went back to their homes, they were regrouped once again, and Rua was now replaced by 2 of his nephews, Bleda, and his younger brother Attila. And with this, begins the new chapter in the history of the Huns. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.